try that. Okay, looks like we're going. All right. Oh, howdy there, Internet people. It's Bo again. So tonight we have a bit of a professional heckler with us, but today is going to talk about something a little bit more important to what's going on. So if you want to know what's going on, you want to be able to follow along, go ahead and head over to http://bit.ly/NYC CORONAVIRS. If it's in Spanish, if you want it in Spanish, add dash ES to it. All right. So tell us about yourself.
My name's Andy Ratto. I'm 35. I live in Brooklyn, New York, and I'm one of the lead organizers of the New York City United Against Coronavirus Information and Resources document, which has become a clearinghouse of information about mutual aid projects in New York City responding to coronavirus, as well as other forms of information and resources which individuals can use as we respond to this ongoing pandemic situation.
Now, are you affiliated with any government agency, or is this something you're doing on your own or as part of a non governmental group?
This particular project is a collection of individuals. What people will be able to see as they browse the document or as people do research in their own communities is there are a variety of resources available responding to coronavirus, engaging in these sorts of mutual aid projects. Some are from the government, some are from established nonprofits, some are from new groups, and some are really just kind of loosely connected individuals. And I think that all of those different organizations have a role to play in the weeks and months ahead.
Sounds good. Um, so, what are you? Let's see. First, how would you classify this? What would you call what you're doing?
Um, yeah, I mean, I think it's we're in this sort of strange situation where a lot of existing problems are really being heightened in extreme ways under coronavirus. So there's nothing new about food insecurity or housing insecurity or a lack of access to medical resources. And those problems were all being dealt with by charities, by mutual aid organizing, by governmental organizations, by nonprofits, etc. And because the need became so extreme so quickly, a lot of people were having trouble finding what was available and connecting with resources. And so I became a guide in some sense to help people find what they were looking for. And that was a lot of the initial impetus for me to get involved in this specific way. I'm also involved in other more direct mutual aid organizing in terms of helping people get access to food and responding to other needs that I'm doing in my neighborhood of Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn. But what I also identified was just a larger citywide issue of people struggling to find the resources that were available. And, I was able to begin pushing out that information via social media, email lists, these kind of Signal and WhatsApp text chains, and had, a bit of kind of knowledge and experience about how to be both a resource locator and a disseminator of that information. And so me and others have kind of played that sort of guide role for people who, for the first time, maybe were struggling to find some of those resources.
Nice, nice. Uh, so, if you were somewhere else. You're watching this, you're not in New York, and you want to emulate this. You want to set up your own mutual aid network. You want to provide your own clearinghouse for your community. Um, where would you suggest people start?
The first thing I would say is not to duplicate resources or projects that already exist or reinvent any sort of structure that might have already taken hold in the community. So we're far enough along that I think a lot of immediate needs are now being met either by previously existing organizations or by groups that have come together in February, in March, in April. And oftentimes that involves hunting around and trying to find out what's been happening already, and who are the people to connect with. Because a lot of the mutual aid that's happening is not big budget website, staff, infrastructure, etc. It's people putting a phone number on a flyer, pasting it on some up on some lampposts down the street, and then getting people out on foot or on bikes to do grocery shopping, etc. So part of the challenge that I was responding to, and the challenge that is being replicated, in cities across the country, is helping people to find those resources that exist already. So as a first step, really beginning to dig around and see what exists in the community. There are some good kind of national level resources that have been compiling that. It's Going Down is one news source that has a pretty comprehensive list of mutual aid organizations operating at the city or the community level. And so seeking out and joining up and partnering with those existing organizations. Like I mentioned earlier, the sorts of challenges that we are facing under coronavirus are extreme, but not necessarily new. And so when we think about, like, well, how do we respond to people who don't have access to food? The people who are the best at that are the folks who've been doing that for the last year, 5 year, 10 years, etc., who've developed relationships in their communities, who know what the most hardest hit areas will be, who've built up trust, who have networks of both helpers and those in need. And so going to the experts or going to people with those years of experience tends to be able to build up a stronger infrastructure, and to be able to learn from their past experience. That being said, at least in New York City, the need was so large and so rapid. We did see a number of new organizations starting up. And there are now these guides coming out, and these resources about how to organize your building, which can be as simple as posting a flyer in the lobby, and setting up a WhatsApp or a Signal chat so that everyone can stay in touch, and then moving from the building to the street, to the neighborhood, to the city, as these kind of expanding circles of both resources and those in need. Um, but overall, we're now seeing, I think, a large kind of groundswell of people coming together to say, we need to be prepared around housing issues that come up for people that can't pay rent. We need to worry about continuing to get people access to medical care as hospitals are becoming overburdened, food insecurity, et cetera. And organizations that are doing this well tend to pay it forward in some sense by putting out materials, resource guides, tech handbooks, etc., that do provide that information, that can be kind of used in a cookie cutter model from city to city.
Yeah. Um, Yeah, there's definitely like we're starting to see, down here in the South, we're starting to actually see impacts, and you're starting to see rural communities that are having these issues. It's the same principle for those that are in those areas. It could be your neighborhood. It could be there's always those locations. Like here where I live, real small town, you would put this information at Sonic rather than in the lobby of your building. But there's always a workaround. There's always a way to make it work. And there's probably already organizations in your area doing it in the South. There's probably that guy at your church who's, not really that churchy, but he coordinates a lot of the charity work. That's probably the guy you want to talk to. That's probably the person that has the connections in the community, because down here a lot of it revolves around the church, even things that are secular. And I have noticed that a lot of times that person is not really what you would consider faithful. He's there because that's where the resources are, or she's there because that's where the resources are. So if you're in a rural community, it can still be done. It doesn't have to only be done in areas with high population density. But their models are probably more effective because they're designed to handle a much higher volume than we would ever see out in the country. So anyway, just needed to throw that in because we have a lot of people that live in rural communities that are looking for this kind of information and don't really know how to start. Um, so I would ask, and here's well, first I got to ask the question everybody wants to know: how's it feel to get to yell at people the way that you have and gotten the press over it?
I oftentimes describe that as kind of the dessert of organizing, or the little treat that comes once in a while. The real valuable work I try and engage in is, long-term base building, political education, pressure campaigns, etc. That just involves a lot of time spent, planning meetings and on Skype calls and, putting together resources. But it's New York City, and ever so often there'll be an opportunity for to go out on a weekend, and Sean Spicer is doing a book tour, or Howard Schultz is running for president, and just the things that I think a lot of people think but don't necessarily get to say, at least not to the people they're thinking them about. I happen to have that rare opportunity to say, and it's fun, and I think it often works, or works well enough. Um, in part because I'm sometimes saying something that a lot of other people are thinking, or that journalists wish they could put in an article, but they're constrained by the kind of rules and practices of journalism, that they can't write it themselves, and they're hoping and wishing someone puts it into words, and they're able to pass it along. And particularly around coronavirus, it's been frustrating because there's been so much failure from our political leadership, in ways that is just being, totally unaddressed. We're seeing some pushback against Trump, from the press corps, but they're doing it in the way that the press does, which is, respectfully, and within the kind of structure of political journalism in America. But at some point, the people who are directly suffering because of mistakes and poor decisions from Trump may get the chance, to express that to him. There have been really egregious failures by Governor Cuomo and Mayor de Blasio in New York City that have just really heightened the impact um, of coronavirus in New York. And Governor Cuomo gets to do his daily, I guess, press briefings, where he's the strong, authoritative, commanding voice, and no one is really kind of bringing up these past decisions and actions where more dramatic measures could have been taken earlier to really curtail the impact. So on a day-to-day basis, the work I'm doing around mutual aid, you know, is hours and hours every day of these kind of various projects. But the little kind of dessert I may get at one point is running into Cuomo or De Blasio and being able to express myself towards them in a way that I'm not hearing anyone say or that is not being um, included in the media in the way it should be.
Right. There's a whole lot of blame as far as preparations beforehand and acting on their own. There's tons to go around for a whole lot of people. Right now it is mainly focused on the person that is most vocal about how perfect they were. Um, I have a feeling that as more and more comes out and as those pre-existing conditions within different communities are highlighted, there's going to be a moment where people look back and say, "Wow, we could have solved this months before this ever happened." It's going to be a fun moment for me because of the way I structure stuff. But yeah, I definitely would see that as a dessert myself. So here's a question I ask everybody that comes on: if you could tell the people watching this one thing that they can do in their community, in their hometown, in their neighborhood, whatever, to change the world, what would it be? Yeah, you got to fix the world in one sound bite.
Um, yeah, I mean, one of the challenges I think of coronavirus is the scale of the impact. We're used to natural disasters in the United States, hurricane, tornado, flood, earthquake, fire. I'm from California originally. We have our share of natural disasters. And those can be, limited geographically. They can be limited in terms of time, in terms of the number of people that are affected. And this particular moment we're in feels very unlimited and infinite. And it's expanding. It's getting worse. I would say every day has been worse than the day before without really end in sight in terms of the human impact. As people are not working, and the kind of secondary economic impacts um, continue to kind of snowball. The situation's getting worse. So the recommendation that I would have for people is to narrow it down and think as small and as local as they can. And we can talk a little bit about kind of the philosophical or the political nature of mutual aid and what it is and why we do it, et cetera. But without kind of getting into the weeds of that, what I would say is any one individual is already an expert in the practice of mutual aid. If you've ever done something like mow your neighbor's lawn or take them grocery shopping or watch their kids, or set up one of those kind of meal trains where such and such Your coworker is recovering from cancer, or a relative passed away and the spouse and children are coping, and people are bringing by meals on a regular schedule, etc. These are all, I think, experiences that we've had, that we're familiar with, and that we have expertise in. And so for people to kind of put aside, just if they're watching this tomorrow, put aside, this upcoming election and the stimulus checks and, rents and mortgages, and think, in my building or on my block, who are the people in need and what is the skill or experience that I might be able to contribute. I think that's a way to kind of ground all of us in the work that we're doing, and to open up the sorts of connections, and build the relationships that we're going to need going forward. Because we don't need to launch, the neighborhood, or the street association coronavirus response committee, tomorrow. That could take some time, or maybe it already exists, or other people are gonna maybe take the lead on that. But what each of us can do is just kind of check in with our neighbors, figure out how we can help, and be someone that's able to say, if there's something you need, you can reach out to me, and I would like to be able to stay in touch with you if there's something that I need. Um, and at least in New York City, those sorts of conversations and those sorts of connections are not always common. There are people who live in apartment buildings that do not know the names of the people in their building. There are people who live, on streets who cannot, have never had a conversation with the people who live across the street from them. And that, can be, replicated across the country. And also, we have this pivotal moment now of people being able to say, we're only going to be able to get through this if we work together. And that doesn't mean solving the biggest problem. It doesn't mean solving the most important problem, but it means taking the steps that will get us, closer to solving those bigger and important problems.
Nice. Nice. Okay. Uh, so what do you think the longevity of these stuff is? These organizations, once they're built, these networks, these community level groups, what happens after the smoke clears? Do they still exist? Do they morph into something else? Do they help address other issues? What's the dream? Where's it go?
So I mentioned before that the problems that we're facing now, are not new, but they're larger in scope. And so I think it's, I would say basically a certainty that the problems that we are struggling to solve now will remain problems after, coronavirus is over, whatever exactly that means. Let's say we come up with a vaccine and a cure next year. We no longer have to worry about coronavirus. There will still be people struggling with, losing their jobs, being in danger of eviction, getting food every day, etc. And it's useful for people in this moment to get involved with this sort of organizing, because they can continue to do that, post coronavirus. Um, there are, some specific ways that we're responding in New York City that may not be essential moving forward. One of the major needs that we're dealing with is people who are now homebound during coronavirus because they are elderly or immunocompromised or really it would be a danger for them to go grocery shopping. So we have teams of volunteers who will go grocery shopping for them. In general, someone who may be, elderly, it's fine for them to normally go grocery shopping. It's great for them to be out in the community. Exercise is nice, sunlight is nice, you know, knowing your kind of corner bodega guy and having a conversation and having some communication is nice. So we don't necessarily need to continue grocery delivery, but we need to continue to assess what are the unmet needs of the community. But it's also, I think, important to kind of situate this mutual aid organizing that we're doing in terms of a larger political context. By which I mean, there's a focus right now on meeting people's material needs, whether it's food, medicine, housing, anything else that kind of directly that monetary needs that we can meet. But we're also, I think, very cognizant of the ways the kind of political and societal structures have exacerbated the problems of coronavirus. So there's a big, debate in Congress right now about what to do about people who are losing their health insurance because they've lost their jobs because of coronavirus. And we happen to have a system of health insurance in America, which for a lot of people ties their health insurance to their job. And when someone loses their job, they oftentimes will also lose their health insurance. And we have people whose, housing is tied to their ability to work. Access to food is tied to their ability to work. And it does not have to be that way. There are plenty of other, ways we can design society, ways we can set up government programs that allow people who are fired not to be in danger of being hungry, homeless, and without medical care. So as we kind of think, well, in the medium to long term, what exactly are we going to be doing in the future? What's going to happen with these organizations that we've built? What's going to happen with this community power and capacity that's being created? Well, we're going to meet people's material needs in the short term, but we're also going to think about what our vision is for the future so that the next disaster, pandemic, emergency situation does not recreate all of these emergency conditions and all of these kind of secondary societal impacts that have created so much damage and destruction. And those of us who've been on calls and in meetings, focused on how do we get people food, are going to say, well, in 2021, who's still hungry in our community and how do we get them food? But also, what are the changes that we need to make? What is the, societal or governmental shifts we need to push for so that people are not going to be hungry anymore? And there's a lot of visions about how that can change and how that can function. There's kind of left-wing big government socialism. There is a kind of, anarchist mutual aid non-governmental approach, and a variety of other ways. And I don't have strong principled beliefs about kind of the best way to solve all these problems. There's a variety of ways we can talk about getting people health care, about making sure that people who lose their jobs do not become homeless. And that is, an important aspect to keep in our minds as we struggle through coronavirus, is not to treat what's happening right now as unique. It's not There's nothing unique about the way people are struggling in New York City and across the country. People have always struggled. Um, and the solutions that we should envision are not just how do I get people groceries for the next 2 weeks, but how do we solve a problem where people in America in 2020 do not have food in their apartments and cannot afford food. That is not, that is worse because of coronavirus, but that is not new because of coronavirus.
Right. Right. Okay. All right. So plug your stuff. Where do people need to go? What do they need to look up? Where does everybody need to kind of get more information, and where can they start?
Yeah, so you gave a bit.ly link at the top of the show, which is this information and resources document for New York City, bit.ly/NYC coronavirus. And that can give people in New York City access really directly to information and resources that they can make use of, but also is kind of illustrating, like I mentioned earlier, people all over the country being able to see what sort of practices are ratcheting up in New York City, how organizations are responding, some best practices, et cetera. Because New York really was at kind of the beginning of this wave across the country and was hit especially hard. I'm part of a group also called Bed-Stuy Strong. Bed-Stuy is a neighborhood in Brooklyn. And we have our own website, bedstuystrong.com, which again, really kind of allows people to see what this looks like in practice at the neighborhood level. And then I mentioned It's Going Down, which is just a nationwide publication, which has been, collecting their own sort of information and resource documents about what's been happening across the country. But again, for any major city in the United States, there have been people struggling with food insecurity, housing insecurity, poverty, etc. And already existing organizations and groups of people have been working on solving those problems. And those organizations, as a general rule, are under resourced. They don't have the volunteers to respond. They don't have the money to respond during good times when we're not dealing with a global pandemic. So any organization that I can think of or that I'm aware of is being hit even harder, and they're out there right now. And if you have time and you can volunteer, you can give time. If you have money and you can donate, you can give money. And if you're someone in need, you can reach out, because really kind of one of the underlying philosophies of this sort of mutual aid organizing is a participatory process. There's not, the people with resources providing and those in need taking, but everyone has something to contribute and everyone has the opportunity to make use of that. And I think what we're seeing under coronavirus is that everyone is being impacted. Everyone is being affected, and we all have something to contribute. And we all, I think, are going to face struggles and challenges and are going to need to be able to identify the resources we can reach out to that will be able to help us.
Love it. Okay. All right. You got anything else? Parting shot? Anything else you want to say? I mean, you summed it up pretty well there.
Yeah, I think I closed on a nice summation of what I was trying to express, and so I won't don't feel the need to belabor it.
All right. Okay. Well, then that's the show. Uh, it's just a thought. Y'all have a good night.